Hello, this is John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University, and this is my presentation, Efficient and Effective Implementation of a Food Fraud Prevention Strategy. This is for the RLPSA, Restaurant Loss Prevention and Security Association, annual conference in August 2019 in Nashville. First off, I'd like to point out that we have a lot of information on our website. There's our website there. You can follow us on Twitter and look for hashtags of food fraud as well. To start, we'll look at our food fraud curriculum. This is an overview of what we do and how we do it. And on the right, you'll see a cycle: outreach, research, and education. When we're here talking to you, that's outreach. That's getting out in the field. That's talking about the concepts. It's learning what's going on and really looking for opportunities where there are those kind of questions. And when we come out here, we really learn some new things, and we go back and we do research. So this is looking at either the literature, looking at other fields, and figuring out how we can move forward with this whole idea of the food fraud prevention concept. And then that works back into education, whether that's our MOOCs or other types of training or teaching or grad courses. It goes into that function and then back around to outreach. The first type of curriculum we have are massive open online courses. These are free, open online to anyone. They're available on demand. They're monthly, and they're essentially 10 contact hours. So if you have some type of continuing education requirement, that may apply there. And then there is a certificate of completion based on a type of assessment. So we have 4 MOOCs that we have in place now. We have several under development. And the first is a food fraud overview. So this looks at the overall concepts, the background, the basics, really gives you a running start. Next is a food fraud audit guide. So if you're either auditing people, whether you're a second-party auditor for your company, internal, or you're getting audited yourself, these are 2 good MOOCs to really be a part of, because one is a food fraud audit guide, focuses on the food fraud aspects, and the second is a food defense audit guide. A key there is these are pretty similar type of assessments when you look at things like the Global Food Safety Initiative or some of the basic risk assessment there. Very different than food safety, but those are 2 that help with that audit guide. And then the fourth we currently offer is VASIP, Vulnerability Assessment and Food Fraud Prevention Strategy. So this is the overall concept of putting it all together, doing that background assessment, the risk assessment, gathering information, and then putting the food fraud prevention strategy in place. We have some other programs that we offer, and one is a conference, and this is a annual update. So you can pick one of them throughout the year to attend, and it's the one-stop shop for you to go to learn about all things food fraud, new requirements, emerging requirements, best practices in the field. We just are having our first one. Registration's closed in August, but we've got October and January coming up next. So these are going to be an overview again. These are going to be giving you the updates, the background, and really helping you either refine your current program or look at how you would have best practices in developing new ones. And the second is executive education. So the first one, September, is closed, but we have another one in February. We'll have another one later in the year. This is more in depth. These are multiple days. These are 3 full days. We'll get into the education part of this. We'll get into really a lot more problem solving for you, a lot more hands-on, and just into a lot more detail about the education. So this is not just an update. This is really teaching you the basics of these concepts. And then a big announcement is that coming, well, actually it wasn't August 3rd, it'll be a little bit later here, Food Fraud Prevention Textbook. It's the first textbook on the topic. I'm the author of that. It is comprehensive and covers everything from the very basics through the education of criminology and risk assessment applied to this problem, supply chain management, procurement, all the way through to food authenticity testing, and then the overall food fraud management systems. So resources for you. So what we've got is on our website are a couple things we really want to point out. I've just talked about the MOOCs. Those are all there. There's a direct link right there. And then we have something that's simpler. And these are 2 to 4 page overviews called primer documents. So whether you need a reference or you need some background on compliance requirements or something like that, we've got these shorter documents there. And then a video library. These are all based and published on YouTube. Some of them are published on our Michigan State website, but they're published on YouTube, and there are a wide range of different presentations that cover a wide range of topics. So we try to have a lot of access for you to learn about a lot of different parts of food fraud. So the agenda here, and I'll call it the hook, trying to figure out. So get your attention here. This is something completely new for you, and to look at what it is that we're going to talk about today. First is, what is food fraud? And really the key is why you care. So it might be interesting to you as a consumer, but in your specific job, and with the topic of the conference here, why do you care? And the definition, to just jump right to the end, is illegal deception for economic gain using food. Right there is the real key. It's all types of this deception. It could be stolen goods. It could be employees stealing stock out of your locations, your restaurants. It could be product being swapped out. So say a valuable ingredient is stolen and it's swapped out with a lower value ingredient. It could be, and could all the way to product coming into the marketplace and into your company. We'll cover that in more detail. And then, do I need to act? This is a real important question, because people look at the current focus is a lot on incoming raw materials, and that's GFSI, some type of certifications, USP standards, things like that. But really, as a company overall, you have some bigger issues, and you as loss prevention and corporate security have some bigger issues to look at as well. So at the very basic level are U.S. laws, the food laws, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. Basically there, it's saying that you have to sell product that's legal. And if it's been mislabeled, mishandled, misbranded, adulterated, under that adulterated food section, then it's illegal. It's unfit for commerce. Second is Sarbanes-Oxley, and that gets into the financial reporting. And so if you're a public company, it's required by law in the U.S. If you're not a public company, still whoever is investing in your company, unless the owner themselves are sitting in the CEO, president, and general manager seat, there's going to be some level of these internal controls that are similar to Sarbanes-Oxley. And then overall consumer fraud. That gets to truth in labeling or truth in advertising, things like that. And then another question about to address with the do I need to act is, are you a staffer or a manager? And this is not a trick question, but is your role to do what people tell you to do, or to look for these emerging risks that are out there and at least bring them up, at least bring up these concepts for further questioning? And that's what we put together this presentation, something as well as with the lecture here, the video audio lecture, is that you've got something you can hand off to someone. What we really see, to jump to the end, is this is a combination. At the very start, there really does need to be this vulnerability assessment of the whole problem, and that would be to look at corporate security and loss prevention together there with supplier quality. That's a different group. And then usually there's some other group involved. There's either logistics, if it's going through a third party, a delivery company or something like that, but really to get together to start just to do this overall assessment. And then it gets to be the question of how to start. I mean, how much more basic can you get than that? And what we really recommend here is taking best practices from other fields and in areas and topics where a new risk was very thoroughly reviewed and competently reviewed, is first get together at this high level and look at this enterprise-wide problem and really conduct a quick assessment. And then you get into the next question of how much is enough. And that's really, really important. And you might not really think about that, but say you have to take an action, is a fence or a door or a lock or investigations or something. When have you done enough? A key there is enterprise risk management. This is already taught. There's already certifications. This is a part of the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. So the CFO's office definitely is trained in this, and it really identifies a risk tolerance. Now, a company is a financial entity judged on financial measures. So we do have to get all these risks, even if they're personal or employee health, things like that. We have to get them into a financial number for this risk tolerance. That's where we can look at how much is enough. And then it gets to be, once you're implementing it, how to manage. This is something completely new. So we really need to step back and look at what systems apply. Now, the key is that's not your role. That's the role of an academic, a theorist. But to take the theory all the way into the practice. And that's something we don't usually see. There's a lot of base concepts and theories out there, but the real step-by-step approach, and we'll cover that as well. So first, here's this whole idea of what is food fraud. So we'll give you a quick overview. So before saying what's food fraud, I'd like to push back and say, what is loss prevention? And that's the scope of this conference here. You'll see my slide in the overhead from last year, and I'm here again this year, so hopefully I did something right. What we see from the different literature that's out there in the discussions is loss prevention is beyond the retail location. This is getting broader into the corporate security and looking at these more enterprise risks. It's beyond shoplifting and employee theft. And you really say and or corporate security. So the lines are the lines need to get blurred because the marketplace is so competitive. We can't stay in our silos. And then general risk management. We hear about that throughout the conferences, is looking at this way to do the risk management. So what we're trying to do with food fraud is get the very basic methods to be able to slot right in to your other assessments. So you can do a very competent vulnerability assessment and understand this level of risk in relation to all other risks. But then also remembering that there is this management system and other types of support farther down the line. So if you have to do something, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then control or prevention of product losses in sales. That's always part of it. That could be employee theft. And then food safety audits. That's a good question of whether those fit into corporate security, loss prevention, quality, where quality sits within a company as well. But you definitely have food safety audits, whether it's more of the hygiene or whether it's a local health inspector. These are a part of the activities of the location. But it is not everything. So loss prevention does have some level. There's some scope creep where you're getting to somebody else's responsibility, but it's important at this point to define where that line is. If anything, it's defensive for yourself to know if there are some of these issues or concepts out there of what is in your area of responsibility and what's not. So consider your role and defining your accountability. That has been so key with this new emerging topic, and it's been important to make sure to help control the risks of a company so you stay in business. So looking at defining food fraud, this was from an article that we published way back in 2011. So in academic terms, that's an ancient document. Food fraud is intentional deception for economic gain using food. This is consistent with pretty much all the definitions around the world. Global Food Safety Initiative, the EU, the EC, the UK, ISO, Codex, and others. So it's a broad definition intentionally, because we've got to cover all these topics. If you think about some incidents that had occurred, melamine in pet food, Sudan red colorant, horse meat and beef, those are all problems that occurred because there was this gray area between the different concepts. Excuse me. Next is including the subcategory of economically motivated adulteration, or EMA. If you're in the U.S., that's a term you may know a little bit more or be more familiar with, because FDA has a currently defined definition of this as a substance for economic gain. A key is that a substance included in food fraud is only one part of food fraud. So as defined by FDA, and if you're under FDA guidelines, so that means whether you're operating in the U.S. or if you export to the U.S., if it's a manufacturer, then you're subject to U.S. FDA, then that's the FDA's definition. And to look at this overall, you start to have to think about, why hasn't anything been done before? And we look at the effect. There's always an economic threat. Always. Because someone's getting cheated one way or another. It's either the manufacturer that's selling the product and you're buying it and you think you're paying for the genuine product or higher priced product. You as a victim buying that product, a government not getting their taxes, consumers not getting what they want. There's always an economic threat. But a key is there's not always a public health threat. Now, when there was melamine in pet food, there it was a public health threat. When there's melamine in infant formula, that was a public health threat. But horse meat and beef, although some people think that was pretty gross, there wasn't really this public health threat. And that's why food fraud has been something that comes into the real focus and then out, because because the food safety public health systems, they respond to that threat, not necessarily vulnerabilities. They move on to the next hot topic, of course, because that's what's making people sick and killing people. What we saw with food fraud is that after a while, when we had a definition of the term, then it really did show companies and governments and associations that this is a real specific problem that needs to have a really interdisciplinary approach. That's why there's been this focus on vulnerability. And throughout this presentation, you'll hear us talk about vulnerabilities. That's a system weakness, not just a actual health hazard. It's a system weakness, some breakdown instead of just the threat. And if we focus on those vulnerabilities, then we can take a really strategic review here. There's a lot of examples. I won't go into detail. What I will do is just give you a quick, I'm not going to go through each definition here, but real key is to have definitions and scope. Our recommendation is when you first write any documents about food fraud, you always have a glossary at the end for the definitions. And the first time you use the word food fraud, or also we'd say for food defense as well, have a footnote right there and have the definition, because there's been a lot of projects that have really gone awry because there's been this confusion about the scope. So it's really important to put that there. One I wanted to point out that there in red is food security. So now it might be you think about physical security, location security, people security, things like that. That's not how the term is used for food. And this is for food. Food security is the safe, continuous, nutritious, and economic supply of food. And this is a definition by the World Health Organization, the UN, FAO, and this is a broad global definition about enough food for people. So if you're talking about protecting the food supply chain from harm, that's food defense, not food security. So there might be a little confusing point there, and I wanted to make sure to point that out. So next is, what is food fraud? So the Global Food Safety Initiative, if you're not familiar with them, their membership is approximately 65+% of the world trade in food, and they're usually the people like manufacturers or retailers. So they have influence across the whole world. And they had a food fraud think tank that started in 2012. I was one of 4 members on that team, ended up growing to 6, and we gave recommendations to the Global Food Safety Initiative Board of Directors. They then used our recommendations and put it into the guidance document itself. So overall, it's looking at food fraud. It's looking at all types of fraud. And this is so important because the bad guys don't just focus on one part of it. They focus on any opportunity. So you'll see up there in the upper left is more traditional concepts of dilution, substitution, contaminants put in there. That's the horse meat and the beef. And then there's counterfeiting, pure counterfeiting. That's outside the supply chain. You'd be surprised how much private label product or product that should be only at a business-to-business operation or something like that can show up in the counterfeit market. And then there's a wide range of other activities that do cause problems in the marketplace and can lead to the root cause of a food safety hazard. And those could be these unimproved enhancements, mislabeling, gray market theft, diversion, overruns, and tampering. Interesting when there's gray market theft and diversion. So a key there is say that you buy a branded condiment and it gets stolen out of your warehouse or your store, your local inventory store. If that product shows up in the marketplace, then that product has been stolen and it's then unfit for commerce, illegal. That could re-enter the supply chain, and then that causes, again, a wide range of problems. We don't know how people store the product. Now, if it's some type of, aseptic packaging of condiments, then probably there's not going to be a public health threat, but we don't know. And the key is that doesn't matter because that is adulterated foods by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. It's unfit for commerce. 2 there in the pink that are kind of add-ons, that are clarifications, are overruns. So this would be like a contract manufacturer that you order 1,000 units and they make 2,000 units. So those 1,000 go to you and then they have the extra that they sell themselves. We don't have control or understanding of that supply chain. And then tampering. Tampering could be date code tampering, could be unauthorized refill. You think about like bags of juices or drinks that are concentrates. Some of those are pretty expensive. And so someone could refill that or change the dates on expired products. So in the upper here in the orange, this is where the FDA really focuses and food agencies focus because this is a public health threat. That's where there's going to be most of those problems. And that's why FDA is focused there in the past. And that's why their concept of economically motivated adulteration is up in that area. But really, overall, all types of food fraud are illegal by all, in one way or another, in all countries under all types of laws. And we'll go into it later. But the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act and the Food Safety Modernization Act, it is illegal under those. And a key for, say, retailers, people at the end of the line who probably don't have a requirement for a GFSI type food safety management system, this is still illegal product, unfit for commerce. So we want to quickly look at what is food fraud in relation to the other food risks. So the food risk matrix has been a really efficient way to look at this. First is food safety and food defense. So we know what these are. We've dealt with those before in the past. The disgruntled employee, the different types of things in there, and general food safety incidents. When we were looking at food fraud, we found that addressing food fraud and preventing it was fundamentally different than all other types of food risks. And so we saw that we had to expand to have this matrix expand to have food fraud be a unique concept. We put food quality in here as well because usually these are all managed under a food quality system, types of work processes, quality management, and even under the same group, whether it's quality assurance for product coming in any way. So we put that there for the entire matrix. On the left, that column is unintentional. We didn't try to create those acts. On the right, it's intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing, and that's a real key. Because they're intentional and they know how they're acting, then they have a motivation. If we still understand their motivation, then we may be able to prevent by understanding their motivation. For food defense, the motivation is harm. It's either public health, economic, or terror. And there's some type of harm for somebody else. They're not trying for gain for themselves. That's where food fraud comes in. The motivation is economic gain for themselves. And again, that's a real big difference. One big difference there is that for food defense, if they're, quote, good at it, we're going to learn quickly, because people are either going to get sick quickly or they're going to tell us because they want to have the terror. For food fraud, they don't want to be found. So a key there is that they're going to work very hard to have that product be unseen and to move through the supply chain without being known. Under food defense, FDA's intentional adulteration rule covers wide-scale harms. Wide-scale harms is just part of food defense, and that's a real key and important point. So if you're dealing with the intentional adulteration rule at all, then if you address that and are fully compliant there, that doesn't mean you're covering all food defense actions. And next, just to remind everybody that economically motivated adulteration is a subset of food fraud. So, supply chain vulnerabilities. When we're going to look at, say, for a restaurant, where are the supply chain vulnerabilities, and where is your level of focus and response? Really, we've got incoming goods. So that's you've got supplier quality. So if you're making whatever food you're making, there's a group that does the buying, and there's usually a quality assurance group with them. They're focused on that product coming in. It's still important to have corporate security involved because there are some other activities going on there. You've got then in manufacturing. So this is really HACCP, especially for manufacturing. That would be in the manufacturing process. So fraud that would occur there would be something like an employee that's stealing a high-value product, swapping it out or not using it, or a rogue plant manager or store manager that's trying to boost their profits by not using that product. So food fraud can occur in the operations, and finished goods. And so this could be product. I mean, sometimes with a restaurant, you are just handing the finished good to people, but there's a lot of other products that leave your store. It could be now to delivery. That's a whole nother area to think about for loss prevention. But also distressed goods, goods that are off spec, waste, goods that are beyond the expiration date. So there's a lot of things there. There's also technology transfer contract manufacturing. So this could be franchisees. This could be other countries where it's beyond the franchisee. It's really a licensing agreement. They still have your brand, and that product could show back up in the marketplace in different places. And then also outside the supply chain completely. And you would be amazed at what people will counterfeit. So it's definitely worth occasionally doing one of those type of market monitoring to see what's out there in the marketplace. But overall, this is the entire food supply chain. So a key with this is that this is what your company has to deal with. And maybe quality assurance for the suppliers is just looking at that item one, the inbound, and someone else is just looking at consistency in manufacturing. Maybe legal and licensing is looking at number 4, and finished goods might not even be thought about other than in the sense of inventory being stolen. But a key is this is the entire problem. And so it's best for your company to first go look at this in the big picture for all of these at one time. Next is to look at, say, okay, well, yeah, our company needs to deal with that, but that's not me. That's not me. Well, I'm pointing out here that corporate security and loss prevention with supplier quality, that's where it's been the optimal group to do the initial assessments. And one thing we'll look at is who owns it, and it's the contribution to the problem. And what we'll say here is who makes the mess and who cleans it up. So you've got product coming in, and this is, for some of you, this will look familiar. This is Michael Porter's view of the supply chain and of a company, of the value chain. And so you've got the different parts of the operations. And so with loss prevention, you would be up here in the firm infrastructure, the overview, but you'd also be in that area of maybe even operations, of looking at the control of some products. When we look at the problem of food fraud, we look first at who creates it. So there could be people outside your supply chain, say on the far right, so people that are coming in. But then sometimes there could be people within the operations that intentionally or unintentionally create these fraud opportunities, such as changing recipes or something like that along the way. And then who cleans it up? So once there's an incident, A lot of times, like in manufacturing, it's operations that has to go do and manage the recall. There's some type of customer service, maybe sales, but usually firm infrastructure. So it's somebody internally that's crisis management or doing things like that. And then the thing that's interesting is a very different group is a group that could work on deterring it. And you'll see there, like for food fraud, for raw materials, ingredients, inbound logistics, and purchasing are key in there. But then that's very different from the other sections. So the challenge is that sometimes the problem is created in a different group than the group that has to clean it up. So it's difficult from a budgeting standpoint to assign responsibility and accountability. That's the challenge, and that's why there should be this overall review. So next is, do I need to act? Food fraud compliance requirements. And I guess I've probably given away the punchline to a number of these because really the key to all of this is you want to avoid selling illegal product. I guess that makes sense, doesn't it? But that's the real key. At the beginning for a lot of companies, and that would be for your suppliers of packaging and food ingredients, is GFSI. GFSI requires a food fraud vulnerability assessment for all fraud and a food fraud prevention strategy for all products. A key with this is that there's already plans and programs in place. Now, if you're a restaurant chain, then you're probably not going to need to do as much as a manufacturer. But the key is there's already processes in place, and you can use the best practices there. With GFSI, a key is no documents equal audit nonconformance. If an auditor comes in, they're asking to see documentation. If people don't have these assessments or these prevention strategies, then they can't be passed, even if they have them in place. So they've got to have documentation. Now, GFSI also had some of these requirements back to July 2015 in some way or another. There wasn't a lot of activity in that because there wasn't a big push from GFSI. So a key is that for manufacturers, if you're asking your suppliers for food fraud vulnerability assessments for those ingredients that you're buying, it shouldn't be a surprise to them because this was supposed to be implemented back in January 2018. And most likely you do require either GFSI type certification or some type of food safety management system. So your supplier should already have done this. Next is the Food Safety Modernization Act. And this is a preventive controls rule. Wow, this is way back in September 2016 is when this was supposed to be in place. And people say, oh, no, John, that didn't count. It wasn't food fraud. Well, let's look at this. So here's the quote. This is from the Code of Federal Regulations, right in there for everything. This is not just the preventive controls rule. This is all of FSMA. CFR entry there. The hazard analysis must be written regardless of its outcome. So that's for real because you can't just say, we don't think stolen goods would be a problem. That's fine, but you need to show me an assessment. You have to have done assessment. This doesn't say it's 10 pages long. It could be handwritten on a one piece of paper. But the bottom line is that hazard analysis must be written regardless of the outcome. How do you define what is a hazard that requires a preventive control? What you have to do is you have to define what's not a hazard that requires a preventive control. And then people will say, well, but that wasn't the intent. It doesn't apply to food fraud. Not so fast, my friends. There's 3 points under there. And one is the hazard may be intentionally introduced for the purposes of economic gain. It says the hazard. It doesn't say the substance. It doesn't say the contaminant. It says the hazard. The hazard could be mishandling in there. It could be the stolen goods that are where product's not refrigerated. So it's there exactly. It does have to be there. So then we'll look at, but before that, 1938, and that's Steve Ostroff. When he was, Dr. Ostroff, when he's in charge of FDA, he kept saying, I'm really confused here because people are surprised that there's these food fraud EMA requirements. But every type of food fraud was illegal for all products all the way back in 1938, at least by 1938, in the adulterated foods and misbranded foods sections of that act. Also, there's other sections you wouldn't think about, maybe, but such as 301 smuggling. So if you buy product that has been smuggled across the border, tax avoidance, things like that, that's illegal product. And the key is you want to not be selling illegal product. Then you've got Sarbanes-Oxley. That's 2002 and 2017. That's financial reporting requirements. ISO 22000. So these International Standards Organization standards, you may not see them directly, but these are a base for things like the GFSI activity. There is a lot of activity, and food fraud and food defense are clearly identified specifically as a part of that standard. And then there's a wide range of product fraud standards, 12391 and others. 27,000 is IT security, and 28,000 is supply chain security. So there's probably some other standards that are applied either to you or your supply chain, And so there are a lot of different compliance requirements here. And finally, Codex Alimentarius. So Codex is the World Food Code. It's not a law, but many countries, over 100 countries, smaller countries, apply it as a food law in some other country. So if you're then selling product in that country, some other country, then you may be under Codex as a food regulation, and food fraud is being defined within a management system there. And the key is that feeds into everything that we're doing. Every one of these things here is how we scoped out looking at the recommendations that will follow. So how to start? Love the simple questions. Food fraud prevention strategy and really a management strategy. First off, you've got all these different programs going on. Again, it might be security, might be inventory, control, all that. The key that we're doing with food fraud is just gathering those all into one overall strategy. So you may be doing everything that you need to do, but you just haven't got it written in one place. You haven't done an assessment to make sure you've done that. We see that in some cases, companies have already done 99% of what they need to do. The key is they just haven't put it in a plan, or then by looking at it with one perspective in one document, then you can see where there is a gap, and you can identify just that 1%. So the first thing we've got here is a series of academic articles. Now, why is that important? Because if you follow a method here, you can refer to an academic journal article. So someone might not like what was in the article, but you at least have a logic and a strategy of why you're moving forward in doing this. So the first one was 2016 with a couple of food law experts, as well as Dr. Miao and Dr. Wu, our senior food safety risk assessment government officials from China. So we have some interesting international perspective here. And the first thing for food fraud is to just, at the very top, identify food fraud formally and specifically as a food issue. So this is not some other commercial, whatever. This is a food issue, and for especially a food retailer, this is a big deal for what you do. So it is a food issue. And then second, to create an enterprise-wide food fraud prevention plan. So just to say, we need to look at this from the big picture. And again, as I said before, that's bringing together people from an interdisciplinary approach, really like answering a question from the C-suite, the CFO, or if you have a chief risk officer, answering their question across your entire enterprise. When you do that, then you're not going to have any gaps below there. So when we published this article, we realized that there was more questions there, because that sounds, well, great. Yeah, okay, let's do a plan. How do we do it? So the next article here was with, in addition to our previous authors, with Peter Whelan. And Peter's interesting because he is the head of food fraud for the country of Ireland. And he's also a senior member of the different EU food fraud networks there. So very aware of what's going on there, and really focused on specific needs that they have there. So we looked at then to say, okay, how would you implement that enterprise-wide system? So we got these 7 steps. The first thing is to convene a task force. So this would be some senior person that identifies this overarching task. That task force, the first thing we do is to look at and define the overall scope. And the scope really should be all types of fraud for all products. And that would tie into some type of mission statement for what you're doing for this review. Then you conduct a pre-filter. And this is all in enterprise risk management. So this is not something that we didn't make this up. These are things that are already out there in the world. And you do this first really simple high-level pass. The key is, if you haven't looked at all products at once, if you haven't looked at your entire company's portfolio of vulnerabilities, you don't know which ones are the worst. So you start working on one thing or another. Yeah, that's great, but you don't know what the biggest problems are. It's really important and critical to look at that pre-filter. We've got another article and another slide or two will address that. But to do this pre-filter, and that can just be you in a group there. So it can be real simple and quick. Someone told me that you couldn't do it for a country. That was too big of a deal. And nothing's better than having a challenge. And so actually the morning before my presentation, I got up early and I conducted a vulnerability assessment on a specific product for an entire country. Now, I'll admit that I used only my knowledge. I didn't look anything up. I used only knowledge, things that I talked about. But the bottom line is yes or no. Is there now a vulnerability assessment for this single product in this whole country? Yes. Now, the important part about that is I'm not saying that that's really robust or really certain. But a key is there is one. And at that point, then other people can look at that and say, well, you didn't include this, you didn't include that, you need more data there. Well, that's great, because there is one, and there now can be process improvement. And with that process improvement, you move into to identify where there needs to be a more detailed assessment. So you do this initial screen for your whole company, and then you go into detail where you need more detail. Now, there's probably going to be 90% of the products that are just very low for some reason or another, low consequence, low likelihood, but there's going to be some that are a problem. So that's the key, is to look at those and you figure out how to do more there. There's a lot of guidance on this. This is a lot more detailed, but there's a lot of guidance out there. And then from there, you review these vulnerabilities in an enterprise risk map, because the key is we're not looking at food fraud incidents in relation to food fraud incidents. We need to look at food fraud, this emerging risk, in relation to all other risks, because it might end up that all your food fraud risks are so low compared to all your other risks that you don't need to do anything but monitor. In other cases, you might find a couple that are really high or a lot that are very high. And then at that point, then you have this calibrated for the CFO of where these risks fit into all other issues. Now, you might say, I don't have budget for that. Well, when there is a problem that could be enterprise-wide, killing your company, budget shakes open. So that's a real key, is that there's not just budget around for whatever, but you need to do this assessment, and we'll show that a little bit later as well. Consider consider countermeasures and control systems for the very high and high vulnerabilities. Just start to think about what you might do. If there's an employee theft out a back door, of a video camera, or how you monitor inventory. Maybe there's more active computer looking at inventory in and out, things like that. Just to think about that, and then write up the proposal. So that task force gets back together and writes up the final actual proposal. This goes back to that senior executive, and then they can ask real questions about the tasks, about the vulnerability, about the human resources applications, allocation of financial issues, money, and there can be real questions there. What's also important there is that with that proposal, if nothing's done, then there is a de facto endorsement of the current state, that everything's fine. So that's a real key, is the steps to move forward. Now, to talk about this is a methodical approach. So at the Food Safety Summit in May 2018, this is not just theory. These are things that have been implemented. And you'll see here this food fraud prevention cycle. This is presented by Wegmans. Jillian Kelleher is Vice President of Food Safety and Quality. She presented it there 2018. And they talk about this food fraud prevention cycle that they're implementing. And one thing that's great is that's a management system. Again, a cycle. You've got a process there. And they point out that the number of points that they have there is, they're involved with us with our Michigan State University work. They convened a task force. They did training to get started. Then they did the enterprise-wide policy with procedures. They looked at what was in there, what needed to be clarified. They got agreement from the executives. They conducted this pre-filter. They conducted more advanced vulnerability assessments. They looked down at enterprise risk management, and this is over a year old. So they were at the point where they were then looking at the continuous monitoring, horizon scanning. So that's back to this prevention cycle. So it's going from in the midst of looking at the project development, it then starts to look at the management of the implementation, and that's where they go from number 8 to number 9, considering the vulnerabilities, and then establish this corporate-wide prevention strategy. So there is a cycle here. This is also reinforcing that there's best practices of what other people have done. So when we're looking at the overall concept, we call it VASIP. So if you think about HACCP for food safety, this is VASIP for vulnerabilities. Food fraud vulnerability assessment and critical control point plan. Key is we look at vulnerabilities all the time with this to start. System weaknesses. Food fraud really occurs so infrequently and so variable of how it occurs that we really need to look at general system weaknesses. Now, this is not anything that's really novel. It's based on a lot of other things that have been out there. So if you look at the very top, ISO 22000 and HACCP. So this is the same concept. It's like HACCP, but for VASIP for food safety. On the left is ISO 9000, that's quality management. 31000 is risk management. 6 Sigma is quality management. Principles are the same. The upper right, ISO 22380, those are the product fraud international standards. Below that, the food regulations. So this is consistent with some of the requirements of FSMA and laws and regulations, import laws. And in the far left is the financial reporting. So when we really went back and looked at this whole vulnerability assessment, we looked at everything that was being done already and just adapted them. So there's nothing really new here. It's just the application is more refined. So we're getting to how much is enough then. So we've moved along the way here, and so decision-making is real key. So you've got this assessment. How do you then really define how much is enough? First off is looking at enterprise risk management, ERM. This is financial and managerial accounting. And this was a group called the Committee of the Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. They were established after Sarbanes-Oxley became a law, and basically the government said, you guys figure it out, or we're going to figure it out for you. So it's always best to come together in a controlled environment to figure out these best practices within the application, and that's what happened. And so it's a regulatory requirement. Started out for insurance and finance, but gone across all products, all public companies now. And it really is a standard for financial reporting practice to reduce operational surprises. So that's the vulnerability, horse meat, melamine, things like that. Identifying and managing multiple cross-enterprise risks. So this is a crazy thing of food fraud. And you're sitting in the audience thinking, how does this even apply to me? That's what this is for. Run it through this, and it will then identify whether it's a problem or not. But at least you've run it through. Improving deployment of capital, and that's a key. Then where should you spend money to have your company be as secure and sustainable as possible? And here's how they apply it, called the COSO Cube. And you'll see where it says start. So if you think there's a food fraud incident, that's an event identification. How great. It's already there. We don't have to figure it out. Now, the key is figuring out the process that they use, or the template, or the concepts that they put into that event identification. But then enterprise risk, ERM, it'll manage this for us. Because look below there, risk assessment, risk response, control activities. You don't have to decide how much is enough. It's not your gut feel, and your whole enterprise is hinging on your how you feel today. No, there's systems in here to look at that. And then once there's this assessment at this corporate level, you see that the column on the left is strategic. That's at the corporate strategic level. Also look down the right into the depth, entity level. That's where it starts. The real high level, the CFO, the chief risk officer type person. And then once this is analyzed, it goes down through the operations, from strategic to operations, reporting, compliance, and then from this entity level, corporate, into the division, business units, and down to subsidiaries. How great is that? We didn't make this up. This is all already in the marketplace. This is already implemented. So we have a way to calibrate this food fraud risk. And how do we do that? The thing is, we look at this whole hazard analysis and hazard identification. And this is an enterprise risk map. And whether it's red, yellow, green, blue, or red, orange, yellow, green, blue, there's essentially this chart for a company. Now, whether they share it with people or not, it's usually extremely commercially sensitive. But this is out there. And so what we want to do is try to figure out where this food fraud incident is. So say you get a text right now about an incident. How bad is bad? Do you run screaming out of the room? Or do you wait till the end of the lecture? Do you wait till tonight? Do you wait till tomorrow? Do you email it to someone else? Do you deal with it yourself? Do you call the CEO right now? How bad is bad? That's the real key. We don't usually have a way to judge that. Once we implement this, we start to calibrate how bad is bad. We look at this whole idea of this decision-making and risk tolerance and risk appetite. So it's not specifically a line, but there's generally a range where, you're like, don't worry about that. We can wait till tomorrow. Or again, you run screaming from the room. What we want to do here is look at this A, B, or C to see, so that you in your mind, at least those two extremes, that you've got some way to consider the likelihood and consequence to think, whoa, this is really bad. I need to go do something. Or the opposite then is, oh, well, no, that's not so bad because of this and that, or we have controls in place, or it's not a public health threat. And that's a real key, and that's what enterprise risk allows us to do. Now, also, if you start to try to figure this out for yourself and your own group or your food fraud team, then you now have something you're going to those risk managers. Now, you may all of a sudden think something's in the A zone, in the red, terrible, run screaming from the room. And then I say, oh, no, we're not so worried about that because whatever. Well, then they're helping you understand the likelihood and consequence. That's a real key. And that's why this is so strong, to have increase that communication. So when you're doing this, you've got this pre-filter. Fortunately, that's another academic article. We saw this as a need. And again, the key is that an academic article has been very well thought out, laid out in a maybe very dry way, but very thorough way. So you've got some guidance. But most importantly is then, if you're following something like the FFIS, then you have a citation. So you have a science-based, peer-reviewed journal article by academic experts on the topic. And really what we've got here is, it's a novel food fraud risk assessment proposed and referred to as the initial screening, or pre-filter in some cases. A key is that's the terminology of enterprise risk management. So with that is that a ERM manager or Sarbanes-Oxley audit, things like that, they would understand if you talked about something as an initial screen, they would be clear that that's not a detailed vulnerability assessment. They would know what you're talking about. So there is a lot of activity there. Now, this is about a 2-day, in-depth, 8-hour-a-day workshop. So we're not going to go into details there, but just to let you know that there is a real foundation there to get started on this. And the corporate risk map. So we look at all risks or vulnerabilities. They need to be assessed. And it would be like a food safety manager. If I handed a food safety manager a lab result right now that said there was salmonella in your product, or if you saw a text alert or Twitter feed, whatever, that said there was salmonella, you would run screaming from the room because you know that that's really bad, and well, the likelihood would actually be that it occurred, and you know the consequence would be bad, so you would definitely go deal with it. That's what this chart is for the enterprise risk people. When they see that something is identified as possibly even in the red zone, maybe even the orange zone. Now, they don't have to run screaming from the room right now, but, well, definitely by the end of the quarter, because they have to report on a quarterly basis, definitely annual basis. This starts to identify something as very bad. This is what the system is supposed to do. Now, they might not be happy that they get your phone call that you think that this issue A1 is up in the red zone, but that's what this process is supposed to do. It's supposed to identify those to reduce that uncertainty in the business. And that's a real key that we're starting to have some real good communication. And the key is that the board or the C-suite cannot allow red. Sarbanes-Oxley defines that they're stating when they sign the 10Q for a quarterly or 10K form annually, when they sign that, they say that all risks are disclosed or managed. So if this is an unknown, it hasn't been disclosed, then they need to address that. And now they could address it by just disclosing it, or maybe there's some other assessment, maybe there's insurance that brings it within the control, but a key is that they cannot allow red. So how to manage. Food fraud vulnerability assessment and GFSI. We'll look at this whole management system process. So you've figured out what is food fraud. Do I need to act? You at least need to do an assessment. You at least need to do that. And then what do you do? So you've got the enterprise risk type concept of how much is enough there. So now it's how to manage. So again, to support, there's an academic article. We saw this need for this food fraud prevention cycle. It's really a management system that's been refined from other best practices, but into addressing food fraud specifically. So again, the important thing is you have a peer-reviewed journal article you can refer to. I'll go into detail, but give you summaries now. First off, it's a proactive approach. Identified this need, that really looking for the strategy, identified a need for a management system. And the food fraud prevention cycle is a methodical approach to connect everything to everything. So it's every activity. Say you're looking at new traceability systems, or you're considering that, or a new test, or a new video camera, or inventory control system. Now there's a way to judge all those, at least for food fraud, connecting all that information to itself, and includes an integration into the ERM-COSO enterprise-wide risk assessment system. A key is this uses all the same terminology and concepts that apply to ERM, that apply to GFSI, to FSMA, to other types of laws and regulations. So it's all there, and that's a real key. So what we'll show you about the food fraud prevention cycle is there's kind of some fundamental concepts. Is overall is academic disciplines. So that's up to us to go learn those, really, to immerse in this interdisciplinary approach and present those to you in a way that is understandable. And then fundamental concepts. So this is different than an academic discipline. This is applying a wide range of concepts into operations. And on the far right is the application of the guardian. So this is a criminology concept. And you, corporate security, the corporation, supplier quality, you are the guardian. You are people that are monitoring the system, and you're part of the controls there. So here's the cycle. And we'll start on the left there of information. So you have new information, right there when you're gathering information to do an assessment. You gather the information, and then you consider the fraud opportunity. It's all about the fraud opportunity. You want to understand why bad guys think you're a target, why they think it's easy to take that product out the back door, and then you have to do an assessment. You always have to do an assessment. You can't just say something's bad or get a gut feel like, oh, we got to work on this. You have to do an assessment to really understand where this fits in relation to all other vulnerabilities. And also sometimes something seems really bad, but maybe the likelihood is something unique about the likelihood or the consequence or some type of countermeasure you already have in place that it's already actually under control. That's where you get down to do this enterprise risk management. And you really look at the enterprise risk, and that leads to this rank. That's where you can judge if it's above the line or below the line. At that point, then you consider countermeasures or control systems, and that is new information that goes back around to the fraud opportunity. So within there, this is the crime triangle. So if you're a criminology scholar or background, then this is familiar to you as the crime triangle, situational crime prevention. We're looking at the space of crime. The space could be you buying product from all the way around the world, but a key there is that this is the space of crime, and we reduce the fraud opportunity by having the victim be more aware, like you, or the fraudster being concerned that they're going to get caught and understanding how they operate. But really the big key that we can look at is the guardian and hurdle gaps. And so these are, as the bad guys evolve, we need to change our game as well. The vulnerabilities evolve. So that's guardians looking at it, or hurdles are to make it harder for bad guys to act. That could be like for refilling bags for beverages, is there's now tamper-evident, tamper-resistant tags. So you can't just open it and put it back on. Those kind of things would be hurdles. And then, so the thing is, we're trying to connect. This is the background, the education. So anybody coming into this to work on it, if you're working on this, there's a lot of education there to understand the basics, and the process is lined out. And we went further to identify the subroutines or the activities within each of these. So you look in things like assessment. Remember I talked about the initial screen and the detailed assessment. So right there's more information. There's academic articles, there's methods, there's processes. And we look at incidents, or this information coming in. There's 3 types of information that we identify. One are known incidents. So that could be that news alert you get. Could be scanning. Partially there, that's looking at things like maybe things are happening in other industries that are similar, or supply shortages, and also then public policy. So if a government or whoever says they're going to start looking at horse meat, or in Ireland they bought some new DNA species testing equipment, so their ability to detect could go up. That's new information that could change the fraud opportunity because there could be more detection. The key is this whole bit of countermeasures. There's so much going on in the world with all these new ideas and concepts, and one of the big one is traceability, more traceability. And there's all this talk, more is better, but you need to judge that within your frame. You need to look at every new countermeasure and judge whether it specifically helps you, because maybe you've got such a tight supply chain. Like if you think about a quick serve restaurant, you're making it, you're handing it to someone. There's not a long supply chain from the time that your cashier, your handler is handing it to the consumer. So you might not need traceability from production to consumer at all. You don't need high tech for that. Next would be something like investigations or audits, because you're looking at, in that case, then it would be looking at the process of how you hand it to people. Is there some vulnerability there? That audit investigation could be looking back upstream at suppliers as well. An investigation audit are 2 things. Audit is looking at the process, they have the process in place. Investigation is looking at if there's a problem to really look for the root cause. And then testing. And with a lot of products, there's this problem with food authenticity. So there's different types of tests you can do along the supply chain to make sure that product is safe and secure. And so we look at this entire system. We're now defining the subroutines. So even under things like public policy, you could have routines in there. Well, who monitors public policy? Well, what do they need to know? How often do they get an update? How often should they give that update to the food fraud team? Those are all good questions to ask, but at least there's now a management system. So if you move forward with this, that there's a structure here. And also, this is a harmonized set of terminology and concepts. So whether it's a cookie manufacturer or a fishing fleet or a retailer or a quick serve restaurant, everybody will be using the same concepts and terminology here, so we can share best practices. I love ending. Okay, that was really great, but so what? Well, what we'll review is the key learning objectives for today, of what we said we were going to cover and the importance of for you at this conference. So we looked at first establishing the context. That's actually the bigger picture than what is food fraud and is it a problem? And that's a real key, is just defining this new issue and looking again, is it a problem? And you look at how to detect the fraud acts. That's part of this. We didn't go into detail here, but that's a part of it, is how aware could you be, or a consumer be, of if fraud does occur. That's under this, what is food fraud? Do I need to act? We definitely covered that. And it's looking at a combination of do you need to act and what do you need to do right away? The key is that you could have product be illegal in the marketplace, unknowns to you, but you need to act at least to do an assessment. And that's a real key, just to do this very first assessment to see if it's even a problem. You are not opening a can of worms. You're actually identifying a vulnerability and risk that your C-suite is already accountable for. That if one of these things happens, it's not something new. You didn't create a problem. You're helping them be aware of what they're already vulnerable for, too. How to start. So that's what we looked at, what to do and how to measure success. So how to start was that process of that food fraud task force, working through there, working on these initial screenings, the assessments, and then how to measure. That's a part of that enterprise risk of looking at controlling those vulnerabilities within the risk tolerance, and then how much is enough. But that is just so key. I guess we could go on for a long time talking about this, but if there's a requirement to quote secure the building, what do you do? Do you put armed guards? Do you put a vault on it? Do you just have a lock? Do you have a timed lock? Do you have a gate keys, cards, whatever? How much is enough? That's a real important question. So when we look at enterprise risk, that helps us to define that in relation to the laws and regulations. So a combination there. And then how to manage. And this is really about continuous improvement. And you'll notice there the food fraud prevention cycle is a cycle. It's a system. It continues to cycle. Now, how fast it cycles, again, depends on your needs as well. So with that, I'd like to first say thank you for the conference. This has been great for me. I'll come back every time and any time you invite me. Great locations, great activity. Love to be a part of all parts of it. It's been phenomenal. Also, I'd like to really thank Michigan State. There's been a lot of people at MSU that have been very supportive along the way. This has really been a challenge sometime, looking at a new topic, new concepts, interdisciplinary. So a lot of people to thank there as well. And with that, we'll take discussion.